Everybody, you've just seen the film about Habitat Norway, which is a small but active NGO working with problems related to urban settlements in the global south and north. My name is Alexandre A. I'm the deputy head of Habitat Norway. Habitat Norway have arrangements like this, events like this, but we produce also different types of reports that you can see on the tables next to you. And we are quite proud of providing some master's grant for people doing interesting projects at different universities. And today you can see two projects, one about sharing urban public spaces and infrastructure, and one about a very exciting kindergarten in South Africa. So you can look at this afterwards. And I hope if time is kept well, you can, after the next film, be able to have a cup of coffee at the back. Then I think we will take the next film, which is an art project by Hannah Asafawi. It is called There Are No Neighbors Here Anymore. I think it's quite a strong interpretation of a type of housing challenge we are in. So let's see the film.
Hei, jeg heter Hanna. Er ei jente i 20-åra, født og oppvokst i Norges hovedstad, mer spesifikt. Bydel Bjerke og Grünerløkka. Jeg ble faktisk født på Grünerløkka. Fordi min mamma ikke ble trodd av sykehuset da hun sa hun måtte føde. Deres dokumenter sa jo tydelig fra om at jeg ikke skulle komme før den 16. og dagen i dag var bare den 14. Og denne afrikanske kvinnens stemme, den veide mindre enn deres ark. Så de sa det var bedre å holde seg hjemme før de sendte henne på dør. Og i stedet for på Aker ble jeg født i en sykebil rett utenfor blokka der familien min bodde før. Før fancy burgershopper og cocktailsteder. Før overprisa vintagebutikker og kule studenter før Løkka ble stedet for de med penger.
Jeg vet hva dere tenker. At studenter ikke har så mye penger, men se for dere å ha litt mindre. Det var det vi hadde. Men det gikk greit, for vi hadde en annen type rikdom.
Vi hadde grønnsakssjapper drevet av babaer som ga oss gratis saftposer, Vi hadde bestemødre med bunnløse tvistposer, Vi hadde naboer som faktisk var naboer, og vi hadde et hjem i hver eneste etasje, fordi vi var hele bygdas unger. Vi bodde i 1 av 3 blokker, med til sammen 155 leiligheter, alle kommunale og bygget på 30-tallet. 2 etasjer under oss bodde det en mor og datter. Dattera het Anine. Anine. Nabojenta. Som ble til venninna, som ble til bonussøstra. Vi var som regel ute og lekte hver dag. Stod på rollerblades eller hoppet strikk eller sklei på sklia ved sandkassa og... En gang så stakk Aninen seg på sprøytespissen som naboen hadde glemt igjen i sanden. For på Sandegata 32 bodde også de som livet hadde gjort slitne. En av de bodde i øverste etasje ved siden av eller i loftet. Vi prøvde oss på noe detektivarbeid, men fant aldri helt ut av det. Anine lurte på hvorfor leiligheten vår alltid lukta krydder. Jeg tror hun likte det. At det lukta hjem på en måte. Og jeg lurte på hvorfor håret hennes alltid lukta røyk.
Jeg husker en dag vi var hos henne, og vi så på film på Løvenes konge, og så begynte å banke på døra. Og bankene, de ble høyere og høyere og høyere og høyere og høyere. Og mammaen til Anine begynte å skrike, og Anine begynte å gråte, og jeg forstod ingenting.
Hun sa det var pappaen som ville komme inn. Han sa aldri fra når han kom på besøk. Anine elsket å overnatte hos oss. Men mamma og pappa ga meg aldri lov til å sove over hos henne. Vi flyttet da jeg var 5, og jeg så aldri Anine igjen.
Det skal sies at mine foreldre har vært så flinke til å ta vare på meg, sine og så mange andre, men jeg klarer ikke. Jeg klarer ikke å tilgi det de gjorde mot Anine. De forlot henne. De forlot henne et hjem som ikke var helt hjemme, og jeg vet jeg nettopp sa at vi hadde et hjem i hver eneste etasje, men jeg vet ikke om det også gjaldt Anine. Om hennes egen etasje var hjem for henne. Det jeg vet, at mine foreldre hadde sittet og slite med. At kommunalboligbyen kanskje ikke var det riktige stedet å cope med alle årene som gikk tapt i krig og faenskap alle sårene, og dagene de går. Dager blir til uker, uker blir til år, og jeg forstår både mer og mindre om denne greia vi kaller livet, og innimellom så tenker jeg på Anine. Jeg lurer på om hun hadde kjent meg igjen. Om hun savner blokka på Løkka like mye som det jeg gjør, og så lurer jeg på om hun fremdeles synes det lukter hjem. Hver gang hun går forbi krydderdisken. Hun var ikke den eneste vi dro fra da vi flyttet. Vi dro fra Kasper. Nabogutten som også gikk i klassen til søstera mi. Han bodde hos bestemora si. Hun var en av de som alltid ga oss godteri. Og han sa han måtte bo der fordi pappaen hans hadde tatt for mye medisin og derfor måtte sove for alltid, og jeg forstod ikke. Jeg forstod ikke hva han mente før mange år senere. Vi dro fra resten av bestemødrene med de bunnløse twistposene. Fra babaene med grønnsakssjappene og saftposene, fra alle hjemmene i de forskjellige etasjene. Noen år etter at vi flyttet,
ble hele blokka, pluss de andre 2, altså de 3 som til sammen ble Sanner-terrassen. Ja, de med 155 kommunale leiligheter. De ble solgt. Alle sammen ble solgt den samme dagen til den samme karen, til Fredensborg eiendom. Og nei, det å døpe det om til Heimstaden, det gjør ikke noe koseligere. Det gjør ikke noe hyggeligere. Det forandrer ikke det faktum at alle 155 leiligheter blir gjort om til korttidsleie og langtidsleiesteder, at alle disse rommene, at alle disse stedene er eid av Ivar Tollefsen.
Han eier 36 000 leiligheter. Men
jeg kjenner ikke Ivar. Det kan godt hende han er en hyggelig kar, men jeg syns ikke det var så hyggelig av han å pusse opp minimalt for å leie ut maksimalt og bytte ut mine venner mot de med litt mer penger og stjele mitt første hjem. Men det finnes ingen naboer her lenger.
Det finnes ingen naboer her lenger. Det finnes ingen naboer her lenger. Det finnes ingen naboer her lenger. Det finnes ingen naboer her lenger. Det eneste som er igjen etter oss, er en gjengrodd sandkasse. Et lite firkantet minne. Ved siden av en rusten sklie som ikke har blitt brukt siden oss. Et minne som snart skal bli til en ny blokk.
Okay. Let's see now if you get something on the screen again. I think this film shows very clearly how housing is not only about buildings and constructions, but it's equally about identity, belonging, and social networks. And of course, that is the actual big challenge, both to supply the quantitative enough number of dwellings, but also how do you actually create this community and sense of belonging. I think now there is about 30 minutes for us to be able to go and have a cup of coffee because the next part of the program starts at 4 o'clock. So for those of you who have come already, have a look around and see what's there. And for those of you who have joined us during this film and are coming on a bit later, welcome. We have then 12 minutes break and then we'll start again. Thank you. Okay, let's get started again. I'll just repeat, since perhaps somebody wasn't participating when we had the two introductory films. My name is Alexandre A. I'm the deputy of Habitat Norway. Habitat Norway is an NGO that works with urban settlement challenges in the global south and the global north. And we are very happy to be here. I'll say a bit more about that afterwards. In a fortnight, there is a local election at county and municipal level in Norway. And next year there will be a white paper introduced by the federal government on housing policies. And of course, the basic question you can ask is housing, and by housing I mean affordable and secure housing, is it a vision or is it utopian? Big question. According to the UN, housing is a human right. In reality, it's most often a commodity and very often an investment object. The global housing and property market is twice as big as the world's total GDP. Twice as big. And the financial markets, for instance, like Blackstone, influences increasingly both our homes and our cities. Against that backdrop, the goal, of course, must be to provide diverse residential areas with varied services to meet also the climate challenges and to secure integration and cohesion without the segregation that creates inequity. Quite a challenge all over the world. How may we meet these challenges? Today, we will share experiences and views on how we may handle these housing challenges. We will get to know better practices from different parts of the world. Young people, as well as other groups, meet housing challenges most often, perhaps. A master thesis from Trondheim last year described quite well the lack of attaining a home, i.e. a home with other qualities than just being a physical shelter. And that was related to Polish workers in Norway. I think it is the same challenge that also we saw in the film before we had a short break. The rest of this event is divided into three parts. We will first have three keynote speakers on global trends and grassroots movements, Nordic practices and policies, and the right to housing in Norway, referring to, for instance, housing associations. Then in the second session, we will have some benchmarking with the practices from abroad, from UK, Paris, Barcelona, we hope, Vienna and Toronto. And at the end, we are very much looking forward to a conversation between a selection of the youth wing Norwegian political parties, because the youth wing are those wings are those who are going to solve this problem for us in the future. Before leaving the floor to the speakers, I would just have to emphasize that there is no time for questions and answers. However, at the end, when we have the politicians talking, I think there will be reflections that we can share. I would also, on behalf of Habitat Norway, be grateful and thank the cooperation with Trondheim Boligstiftelsen, the Technical University at NTNU, the Trondheim Housing and Town Planning Association, the General Secretariat of Habitat International Coalition, the Metrics Network, and finally a great thanks to the Ministry of Interior Affairs that has funded this event economically. Okay, do you all get a chair to sit on? I hope so. We were going to get a greeting from Trondheim City. I don't know, is Ola Renholm present?
On behalf of Trondheim Municipality, I have the pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar with the title Affordable Housing for All. My name is Ola Renholm. I'm a city councillor representing MDG, the Green Party, in the city council here in Trondheim. Sometimes it is both practical and it illustrates the theme if you can come up with some personal experiences and personal references. During the 90s, when I still was a young man about to establish a family, I changed job and moved between different cities in Norway 3 times. After 4 years in Kongsberg in the southeast part of Norway, and after 6 years in Tromsø in the very north of Norway, and finally after some years in Trondheim when I changed job, the same thing had happened all 3 times, and most shocking, how fast. And the thing was that the value of the house I owned had increased much more than what I earned in wages. So when I moved from job and house, someone new should move in both places. And the effect was that the person who took over my job and my salary wouldn't be able to buy my house. Each new person inherited my job had to move to a place longer away from the center of the town than I lived, or accept a house with lower standards than I had, or be rich to help from, for instance, parents to begin with. This has been a trend for a very long time, and the effect is that it's becoming more and more difficult for young people to get into the housing market without help from their parents. The gaps between the rich and the not so rich is increasing, and we see a growing class separation. Thomas Piketty, the famous economist, said in 2016 that there has been a change in what pays off the most. Is it 1, to take an education, work hard and feed your family through a well-paid job? Or 2, is it to inherit from your parents or marry into wealth? The development moves us away from number 1 and towards number 2. It is becoming a greater consequence for your own possibilities in life in general, who your parents are and how their economy is, than what you can make for yourself by working hard and earn your own money. We have to go back to 1912 from 2016 to find a time in society where these conditions are comparable. I think it was okay to be rich in 1912, but that society isn't what we are longing for now. And as a global society, we have fought hard to develop from there. But in some strange way, we have more or less looped back to the beginning again. The cost for housing, both to purchase or rent, is one of the more crucial factors to define this development. Therefore, we are in a dramatic situation which needs the will to experiment and use drastic means to make a difference and make a change in direction. We have to stop the development that leads us back to the 19th century. As a Green Party, we don't want to forbid or strongly regulate the commercial market or the first housing sector. We also still have to develop the second sector, or the social sector, if you like, which is municipal buildings for people who need specific help to find themselves housing. But this isn't enough. We need to develop the third housing sector. We need to build up and offer homes for people who just want to live a normal life, when the house you live in firstly is your home and not your biggest and most important commercial investment. I feel that we are about to get the right awareness now of these problems, and I hope that we are about to define the ambitions and how we would like the housing sector to look like and how it functions. And I know that we have a lot of important questions, and we don't have the answers yet. That is why we need to try different solutions, start different pilot projects, check out things, and see what works, discuss and learn from one another. It is only through shared knowledge and cooperation we can untie this Gordian knot. This goes for everyone, regardless of political orientation. The solution is not to keep on building smaller and smaller apartments so that the young people can afford them. We don't want a situation where most of us ends up like Harry Potter's in a box under a staircase. And once again, welcome to this important webinar, even if it's already been going for a while. And I hope we will be smarter when it ends than we were when it started. Thanks a lot and welcome.
Let's go to the keynote speakers. We start the session with Dr. Alexandre A. Frediani. He is the principal researcher at Human Settlement Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development in London. He will talk about needs and the impact of housing. And in many ways, he puts the housing question into a structural perspective. So let's listen to Alexandre Frediani.
This is Alexandre A. Frediani, and I'm a principal researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development. I'm also a board member of Habitat International Coalition, representing European members. Thank you for the invitation to talk here today. Yes, we are in a global housing crisis. 2.8 billion people are affected by some form of housing inadequacy, who lack access to adequate housing, more than 1.1 billion of whom live in informal settlements. Yet, despite housing deprivation affecting 1 in 3 of us, we seem to live under what the president of Habitat International Coalition, Adriana Allen, called social anesthesia. As a society, we witness constant housing discrimination and deprivation with no surprise, even labeling the majority of people experiencing exclusion and violence as minorities. It is time to recognize the housing crisis as a human rights crisis, which directly affects whether a fulfilling life is in reach for billions of people. This lack of urgency has seen progress towards the Urban Sustainable Development Goal stagnate, specifically on the critical target 11.1, which states that by 2030, we should ensure access for all to adequate, safe, affordable housing and basic service and upgrade slums. According to the latest UN Synthesis report on SDG 11, the number of people living in informal settlements is growing. The proportion of urban residents in inadequate housing continues to increase, and children remain highly marginalized, significantly compromising the future of a large share of urban population. This global housing crisis is a human rights crisis, and it affects the various dimensions of housing rights recognized by international human rights frameworks, such as security of tenure, availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. While the factors driving the housing crisis are complex, it is crucial to understand the current situation as largely sustained by a housing system that is not responding to the needs of the global majority. Around the world, practice and policy framings usually ignore the true nature of housing deprivation, shaped instead by flawed assumptions about most people's experience of the crisis. This fundamental problem is reinforced by weaknesses in the multilateral system, which has failed to effectively promote transformative agendas to realize housing needs and aspirations. In addition, the cumulative crises stemming from the climate emergency, violent conflicts, ill health, inequalities, and forced migration reinforce each other in ways that disproportionately affect those living in inadequate housing. This existing perverse housing system feeds cycles of marginalization that intersect with inequalities in gender, race, ethnicity, class, and ability, among others. It continues to trap people and places into unsustainable and uneven development pathways. It is clear that we desperately need new ways to talk about housing policy and practice that reflect and respond to real experiences of the world's majority. I would like to start by sharing some data that demonstrates emphatically how access to adequate housing plays a role in the advancement of human flourishment. Then I would like to share a housing justice agenda that has been increasingly being developed through ongoing dialogues and engagements between networks of civil society, academics, and local and regional governments. My key takeaway from those dialogues is a growing agreement that we cannot continue to provide purely technical and discrete solutions to this crisis. I feel a growing demand for a more disruptive and transformative agenda to change the current housing systems, calling for profound political shift combined with more nuanced vocabularies and broad societal alliances based on values of care as well as social and climate justice. Recently, I was part of a team conducting a research on the social and economic returns of improving access to adequate housing in informal settlements. In that research, we were particularly interested in the returns in terms of expansion of human development, which can be defined based on dimensions of health, education, and living standards. In this research, we did a detailed literature review to identify existing studies have been looking at relationship between the different dimensions of adequate housing and its impact on the dimensions of human development. It was shocking to see the range of available evidence on this. In terms of health, for example, various studies established the links between overcrowding and ill health, especially of children. We found a powerful study from India linking lack of access to piped water and diarrhea. From Mexico, we found studies linking lack of concrete floors and various forms of diseases and cognitive development. From Nigeria, we identified a powerful study linking mortality ratio of children with lack of habitability, and so on. In terms of education, from Namibia, lack of access to services and security of tenure have been identified as one of the key impediments for learning. From Argentina, overcrowding has been linked to higher dropout rates, and in South Africa, overcrowding was connected to poor literacy results. From Taiwan, we found a study linking tenure security with children's educational achievements. And across the board, better access to services have impacted particularly girls, as not having to collect water end up improving their school attendance, and so on. In terms of income, lack of affordability and habitability is deeply impacting households' disposable income, as people are having to pay for exorbitant rents as well as housing improvements. At the same time, evidence shows how lack of security of tenure and relocation disrupts livelihoods opportunities, reproducing poverty traps. By drawing on this evidence, we were able to carry out a modeling exercise which allowed us to make some overall conclusions. If housing in informal settlements are improved at scale, countries can see up to the following direct human development returns. As much as 10.5% economic growth, measured as either gross domestic product or gross national income per capita. Life expectancy could increase up to 4% for countries around the world, adding 2.4 years of life on average. More than 730,000 preventable deaths could be avoided annually, a number that is higher than eradicating malaria globally. The expected years of schooling in some countries would increase by as much as 28%. Globally, as many as 41.6 million additional children and young people could be enrolled in primary and secondary education. 1 in every 6 child and young people missing education could come back to school if housing in informal settlements is improved. Even with all this vast evidence, we are still seeing lack of urgency and action. Why? Well, existing studies point to a set of trends that are sustaining existing housing inequalities. This includes the financialization and commodification of land, basic services, and housing markets, difficulties in establishing healthy financial management and governance systems, limited tools to engage in diverse processes of housing provision and city making, limited regulations and incentives for construction and development industry, and a crisis in care and social protection systems. So where is the space for transformation and change? In a series of dialogues and activities, we see a growing emphasis on local alliances to engage in housing policy and practice from below. This does not mean renouncing the role of national and international actors, but it reinforces the possibilities to trigger disruptions to current housing systems from local and translocal actions. These experiences are outlined in a report produced to the Global Task Force in relation to the review of the progress of the housing target of SDG 11. In this report, we highlighted that local strategies can enhance the recognition of housing rights. And this can be done through the democratization of housing data collection, the monitoring of housing conditions by civil society groups, as well as the monitoring of housing rights violations, such as evictions and violations of rights of tenants. In the report, we included, for example, the Know Your City initiative in Lagos, in Nigeria, where slum dwellers federations do enumerations and videos about their communities, as well as community-led mapping about risk traps in informal settlements in Lima. We also identified how local actions are protecting housing rights, as governments are responding to evictions, exclusions, and discrimination. We saw, for example, during COVID, on how evictions were put on hold in many cities as well as countries, demonstrating that when there is political will, this can happen at scale. But it can also happen through the establishment and enforcement of regulations of land and housing markets, promotion of more inclusive and responsive forms of land tenure. In the report, we included land use planning tool in Renca in Chile, creating incentives for social housing initiatives, and community land trust initiative in Puerto Rico, creating community-led mechanisms to manage land and protecting communities against gentrification and market-led displacement. Finally, the report identifies strategies to fulfill the right to adequate housing as local authorities engage in housing provision through public rent and private ownership, as well as by enabling different forms of community-led and co-produced housing. In the report, we included examples of community-led housing and self-management, illustrating how they can create permanent, affordable, and sustainable housing solutions, while also building communities' resilience to address social and environmental shocks. When brought together, we see these practices making meaningful contributions, not only to the urban SDG 11, but also various other sustainable development goals. So, in summary, I see these as an emerging agenda, bringing together housing struggles globally and centering them around the idea of housing justice. I think that this agenda invites us to do 4 things. First, it recognizes the legacy of housing discrimination, and it calls for responses that embraces the politics of reparation. Housing justice also invites us to approach the right to adequate housing as an end, as well as a means for a flourishing life. Housing needs to be prioritized as an infrastructure for sustainable and equitable development. Housing justice invites us to diversify and reimagine what we understand by housing policy, where and when they happen, opening the possibility of paradigm shifts beyond national policies, recognizing a multiplicity of local actors, conditions, needs, aspirations, and capacity to advance the right to adequate housing. And finally, housing justice invites us to promote research and action that address diverse ways of imagining housing futures for all, which I think is one of the objectives of today's event. So I'm looking forward to the conversations and to the next discussions. Thank you.
Statements may seem quite far away from Europe and Norway, but I would just say, wait and see. I would just like to say that Trondheim has one of the more experimental housing projects in Norway, Svartlamoen, but we can hear about that later, I think. Okay. The next speaker will be Jardar Sørvoll. He's a Norwegian historian, research professor at Oslo Met University, heading housing, the Center of Housing Well, which is a Center for Housing and Welfare Research. He's an expert on Nordic and Norwegian housing policies, and recently he was appointed the head of a governmental policy commission that is revising the Tenancy Act, husleieloven, which has been heavily debated in Norway. I think he will share with us an overview of Norwegian housing policies.
I've been invited to speak to you today, this very interesting Habitat Norway conference. And today I'm going to talk to you about the Norwegian housing regime in a comparative perspective. And I'm also going to discuss if it's the best of all possible worlds, or if there is something that is left to be desired, and maybe there's something rotten in the whole housing regime that we need to change, and maybe change fast, given recent developments. But of course, I'm a researcher, not a politician, so I'll generally ask questions and not provide too many answers in this very short 12-minute lecture. So first I'm going to talk to you about what I mean when I talk about a housing regime. And then I'm going to talk to you about the Norwegian housing regime in the post-war era in 2 minutes, if that's possible. So you have to bear with me. Then I'm going to discuss if we're actually living in a housing regime that is sort of a Panglossian world of the best of all possible worlds. Or do we have contemporary challenges and maybe also contemporary policy responses that need to fix what is broken in the Norwegian housing regime today? So a housing regime or a housing system, I define that very simply as the organization of production, consumption and exchange of housing in a society. And of course, this regime and its general features may differ considerably through time. And Norway is no exception to that rule. The Norwegian housing regime, after the first years of post-World War II reconstruction, was a classic social democratic regime. It was based on state-planned, subsidized, needs-based housing construction. You know, we built loads of large residential areas and small cities that were planned and were like frugally distributed between a growing population. There were many kids running around in that period. We also had non-profit providers. Generally, housing was not produced to make a buck, but was produced to fulfill needs. For instance, the large cooperative housing providers, they built at self-cost, which meant that they sold homes at the price at production prices. What it cost to produce was also very much the price that was paid by consumers. We also had very regulated housing markets. In this period, it was not considered good to earn money on other people's housing needs. And particularly in the first post-war years, there was a very strict, there were also strict rent regulations and very strict regulations on sale of homes. Then we had a messy phase from the year I was born in 1981 to 2004. This whole housing regime went through a major transformation. And I would say that this is one of the most dramatic policy changes in at least Norwegian post-war history. Housing markets were deregulated. The housing bank, which was extremely important for the financing of homes for all of the people in the post-war era, was transformed into a bank for disadvantaged groups. We also had a gradual transition to a more market-sensitive, market-based housing construction, where the private firms took the lead. So in the last 20 years, we have lived in a liberal housing regime, completely different from the post-war era. We have market-based housing construction. We have targeted state support to vulnerable groups. And by the way, this support is not very generous. It's limited compared to, for instance, the support given to low-income groups in Sweden and Denmark, especially if we look at the costs the state, or the money the state uses on housing allowances. We have now almost solely for-profit providers, and we have an increasing emphasis on home ownership. We have many homeowners, and different from many other countries that try to subsidize the homes of middle class, we also have a very active policy of promoting home ownership to low income groups, which is rather particular for Norway. So the Norwegian housing regime today is not all bad. We're building on a very proud legacy of post-war housing policy, and in some ways one could be forgiven of thinking that this is the best of all possible worlds. We have a high share of homeowners. Almost, or a little more than 76% of us own our own homes, and we arguably have no generation rent. Young people generally buy homes at the same period as the parent generation. There has been a little bit of a reduction in the purchases of first-time purchases of young people, but that is also related to that people today tend to stay longer in education, tend to form families later, and perhaps have a little bit more fun for a longer time. But we haven't seen the same tendency as in the UK and other contexts where young people increasingly are excluded from home ownership. We also have very high housing standards. We are good skiers, good cross-country runners, good track and field competitors. We collect medals in world championships and Olympics. And we also are very close to the top when it comes to housing standards. And we are almost European champions when it comes to avoiding really deprived housing, or avoiding severe housing deprivation. There are very few leaky roofs in Norway. We also generally have residential areas that are safe and of good quality. On the other hand, one can also say that something is increasingly rotten in the Norwegian housing regime. Inequality is a real problem, and we are one of the most indebted countries in the world. And a lot of that debt is homeowner debt. There are not a lot of people that own their homes outright, particularly not the young generation. So we're very sensitive to interest rate changes. And of course, we fear that this mountain of debt, if it all goes wrong in the housing market, if prices start to fall, the effects will ripple through the economy and cause unemployment. We also know that housing wealth is a large source of inequality. And scholars from Statistic Norway have shown that if you take housing wealth into account, the value of imputed rent and the value of capital gains of homeowners, the Norwegian inequality increases a lot. The housing market is also an inequality generator, and sadly it's the fact that those living in what was originally the most expensive parts of the housing stock, they've made more from their housing than other people that own more modestly priced homes. And of course, the inequality that is generated in the housing market increases inequality between renters and homeowners, and increases inequality between the central parts of the country and rural parts where housing prices, of course, are much lower. Currently, we also have what you could call an underinvestment crisis. Housing construction is limited, and that is a real concern for affordability in the future. We also have a somewhat neglected rental sector. We have challenges in the social rented housing sector, which is very small. We have challenges related to low standards and discrimination, even though I must say that many tenants are satisfied with their homes. We also have soaring rents, particularly in Oslo and the Stavanger-Sandnes region. And this is a real worry, particularly for low-income groups. So maybe we are approaching an underinvestment and affordability crisis in Norway in the future. We have higher interest rates than we used to. We got really used to low interest rates. Many of us took up large loans, but interest rates threaten to make home ownership increasingly unaffordable. We also, interest rates spill over into the rental market because people that buy homes to let out, they pass on increasing lending costs to their tenants. So we have seen a dramatic rise in rents in central areas during the last year. And when you combine that with increasing prices on essential commodities like food, then the weakest groups are hit dramatically. And we see that housing costs, the people that have problems with a heavy housing cost burden is increasing. Perhaps the problems in Norway are smaller because we're, in a sense, saved by the past. We have the legacy of cooperative, low-cost, non-profit production in the post-war years, which means that people with modest incomes have the older parts of the cooperative stock in some cities where it's easier to enter and become a homeowner. We have the legacy of the housing bank. We had enormous investments in quite good quality, but also modest housing that I think also is a part of the reserve of modestly priced housing in Norway today. We've also we've been very fortunate with a strong and relatively equitable economic development so far. The question is, what about the future? And I'm going to end with some questions here, because today in our liberal regime, we do not have a reliable source of low-cost, high-quality dwellings. And of course, housing is a commodity where the production in 1 year has great consequences over time. It is, in the future, we're going to live in the housing produced today. So you could ask, do we need to change our approach to housing once again? Are we going to see a comeback for planning and the housing bank because we need a more stable and less volatile supply of housing? Because currently it's lagging, and maybe we need to introduce an element of stability again. Do we need to go back to more regulated markets to protect consumers, perhaps particularly renters? Do we need to tax more to combat housing wealth inequality? Or are we going in the other direction with even more market-led development and perhaps increased focus on targeted support to low-income groups to support those that cannot take responsibility for their own housing situation in the market? Unfortunately, all systems and all system shifts face their own problems. Maybe if we regulate markets too tight, then the supply will lag. We will create more problems than we actually solve. I'm happy that I will not, at least not alone, have to fix these problems because they are very complex. But my prediction that I'm 100% sure of is that housing will remain a sore spot and a source of trouble for all thoughtful social democrats, because no matter what direction we will head in the future, there will be problems when it comes to distributing the profits from housing, and also how we distribute floor space and quality in a society where we have high ambitions when it comes to efficiency and equity. So that's all I want to say. Good luck with the rest of the conference. Thank you.
The privilege of researchers is that they don't have to give the answers. And I was expecting him to say, we need to do 1, 2, and 3. But I did notice that he said more planning and more taxation, perhaps. Okay, Let's go to the last speaker now. That is Kathrine Emilie Standal from Trondheim. She is advisor to the Habitat Norway board. She's director of the Trondheim Housing Association. Do you call it association or foundation? I'm not sure, but I'm sure she'll tell us. She has a master's degree in society, religion and global issues, and she has formerly been the director of Svartlamoen Housing Collective, which I mentioned briefly, perhaps the most experimental self-building housing project in Norway. And now she's a member of the Policy Commission for the Tenancy Act that I mentioned earlier today too. So the floor is yours, Kathrine.
Thank you. Yeah, tack. Okay. Yes, I'm not a researcher, so I like to say sometimes that I'm an activist or just a person who likes to mean a lot of things about a lot of different things. So, yes. Oh, let's see. Yes. Affordable housing policies, how is it working in Norway? I guess some of you know the answers maybe already, but I'm trying to say something to fill in what Jardar said first. Well, the housing policy has changed in many ways, but it's been stable also, because we have had a long time since after the post Second World War, a quite stable 80% who has been owning the houses and 20% tenants. This is changing, and there are now an increase in tenants and a decrease in home ownership. This is also, the graph shows, the blue one is the salary income, and the red one is the housing prices. So as you can see, the housing prices are increasing much more than the paycheck. And that's especially in the big cities. And that means that more and more people also has to rent. Well, just some short story, but the state has encouraged us to own our own houses. And I think that's a very good idea because it gives you a stable house, a stable home. You get to pay down on your mortgage, which it increases your I'm sorry, I'm not used to talk in English, but okay. Well, increase your fortune, and you can save up money for when you're older, and it gives a lot of benefits to the people who are owning their own house. Last year we got over 100 billion Norwegian kroners in subsidies, directly and indirectly subsidies, which is actually quite unfair because it's the 24% who are tenants who are paying that to the 70% people who are owning. So it's not just a change between, or it's the housing market, I think, is giving money from poor people to rich people and from young people to old people. And that's how the system is working the way it is now. It's irregulated, and market-driven, where the people with the lowest income are excluded from the property market. I had actually a call yesterday from a supervisor who works in the municipality, and she's a cleaner. She's a supervisor for the cleaners, and she said to me, "I have this great cleaner, and he has just moved out of his spouse's house and the children, and he's now renting a one-bedroom, one-room flat here in Trondheim because that's all that he can afford. He hasn't seen his children for over a month because the children doesn't want to stay there because there's a lot of drug and alcohol abuse in the building, and he's now thinking that he has to move south to get 2 jobs so that he can afford to pay for child support, but he doesn't see his children." And I think that is just summing up one of the big problems here in Norway. He's a full-time worker just within the low income. So, yeah, that's one of the consequences. But the other consequences, it's the biggest catalyst for inequality. As I said, it's it's putting money from young people to older people and from poor people to rich people. It's almost impossible to buy a home alone, which means if you leave your partner, You might not do that because you can't afford to buy another home, which is also a question for, I think, if we're talking about living in partnership that are negative. If you have violence, either if it's psychological, physical, or economical violence, it's really hard to get out because you don't have anywhere you can move. We are on the world top of private household debt, and it's been growing a lot more the past 20 years than our income. And it's a big problem for the labor market too, because people can't move. If you want to get a job, if I was getting a job in Oslo, I would have to turn it down because I can't afford to buy a house in Oslo. I can sell my house here. I'm very unfortunate. Me and my husband and my bank are owning a house together, but I can't sell it and get something that is affordable for us in Oslo, which means, and it's also a problem for people who want to move into the rural areas, because if you do that, you might not be able to move back to the city. So it's a lot of economical problems with this housing, the way we are doing with the housing market, also for the working or labor market. So if you can't buy, then you have to go to the rental market. And I guess a lot of you are renting now, so maybe some of you are feeling some of the consequences of the rental market. Well, 70% of the rental market is small-scale rental market, which means like people who are either renting out their basement, for example, or have one or two extra houses. I think in Norway we haven't defined what it's supposed to be, whether small-scale or professional, but it's in the taxes. If you have more than 5 apartments or houses, then you have to tax differently, and if you have fewer. It works well for a lot of people. A lot of people who are renting out houses are nice people who just want to have nice tenants, and yeah. But many people have poor housing living conditions, and it's worse on the rental market than it is in the ownership market, and it's an unbalanced power relationship. I had somebody told me that they had told their landlord that they had a lot of mold on the walls, and they said, "Could you please come and fix this?" And the owner said, "Well, if you don't like it, why don't you move?" And it's also a lot of difficult things also with the way the law, the husleieloven, is made, but that me and Jardar is going to change that, and a few other people. But it's a really difficult with a power relationship that is quite, I think, not talked about enough. 30% of the rental market is run by professional rental companies, and they are profit-driven, and values are accumulated in few companies. And idea rental is almost non-existent. The heading says, has made 8 billion on lending out houses in 2 years, which also illustrates that the poor people are giving a lot of money to people who have a lot already. But all is not lost, because I have the solution, or I have one solution. I would say I've launched this new word, allmennbolig, and it's a part of the third housing sector. And it's because the third housing sector is a word, it's a bit academic word, so people don't understand it. You have to know what the first and the second housing sector is before you can use the third housing sector. And also I see that the municipality of Oslo, for example, they say that they are making a third housing sector, but what they're doing, they're making a financial tool for people getting into the first sector. So therefore I said, okay, let's just get a new word. And allmennboliger, it's the same as they have in Denmark and in Sweden, and allmann is something that in Norwegian ears is quite, it's a good word. Allemannsretten, which for example means that everybody is allowed to go out in the camp in the forest or wherever. Well, so I think housing foundations are a great idea, and I'm not saying that just because I'm working in one now, but I have been working with housing foundations for 9 years, and I think that this is a very good solution, because they are not owned by anybody, they are owned by their purpose. which means that even though I want to do something, I always have to go back to look, what is the purpose of the Housing Foundation? And that is what I have to do, and nothing else. And by drawing up good articles of association, you can ensure that the foundation fulfills important social tasks, like giving people a long-term home. And I think we need also distinguish between housing and home, because everybody could get a house or like a roof over your head, but that's a different thing from a home. We are a non-profit, which means that everything we get goes back to the foundation and to the purpose of our foundation. And we are designed to last forever. In Trondheim, we have one of the oldest foundations in Norway, and it's from the 11th century, I think. And therefore, we can make other choices than people who are just developing for selling their houses. Because in Norway, if you have a developer, he or her have the company, have to build something, and then they have to have 5 years, and within those 5 years, you can do a reclamation if something's wrong. After 5 years, it's on you who own it to fix things if things goes wrong. Which means that sometimes, not all, but sometimes they choose bad materials. They are not that looking at how their apartment buildings are talking to the rest of the city. But for example, for us, if I were going to build, we're going to build with good quality materials, because that means less work on. And we are also thinking about how are this going to fit into the environmental around and be an asset to the people already living there, because we're going to stay there forever. Yes, I think this is saying from one of our residents. Low rents, participation, and close neighborly relationships provide a better quality of life and freedom. I have to say, I don't think you get happy by owning anything. You can also have a good home renting, but we need to change that in Norway if that's going to be a reality. Yes, that's it.
As you indicated, Kathrine, some other countries have more of these mechanisms than we do. And I'm sure they are just as happy as we are with under occupation. Excellent. Shall we just sort of stretch our arms a bit and breathe? I think I need to breathe a bit. Let's all just do that before we move into the next session. I think we've heard different sort of dimensions now, both globally and nationally and regionally. And now we will get to a session of shorter presentations from these different cities that I mentioned to you earlier. We will start with Melanie Redman, who is she's the COE of something what is called A Way Home to End Youth Homelessness in Canada. She has a master from Brandeis, I think, University in USA, on management, social policies and change. She has received prizes for her work, and she focuses on the root cause of complex social issues. Let's listen to her.
Hi, my name is Melanie Redman, and I'm the president and CEO of Away Home Canada and the co-lead of the Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab alongside Dr. Stephen Gates at York University. Let's start with a little bit of the Canadian context. So, like many jurisdictions, and not unlike Norway, municipal and provincial bylaws and planning restrictions get in the way of expanding the affordable housing supply. In addition, we have a real problem with Airbnb units taking affordable units off the market in favor of vacation lets. We also have the problem that has emerged all over the world with the financialization of the housing market. You can see this data from the US shows that investor home buying rates from 1999 to 2018 are at a 20-year high. And this is very similar to what's happening in the Canadian context. So what's the outcome of all of this? Well, it means that 18% of low-income Canadians are in extreme housing need. And the social housing waitlists across the country are very, very difficult to manage. In Toronto alone, which is Canada's largest city, the social housing waitlist is 110,000 people. And compare that with what we've been able to build and to bring to bear on the social housing market from 2010 to 2019 of just 4,093 units. So that's just a drop in the bucket of what we actually need in Canada. And so a key outcome is that we've seen a rise in the numbers and visibility of homelessness across the country. And that's in the major cities, it's in the medium-sized cities, and the rural and remote communities of Canada. Now, there are some bright spots in Canada. In 2019, housing was declared a human right. And so what this legislation will do is it will set a new roadmap for federal housing policy. It requires the federal government to develop and maintain a national housing strategy. It creates accountability mechanisms, and it measures and publicly reports on indicators related to the national housing strategy. But what this legislation won't do is it won't create an enforceable individual right to access housing. It doesn't apply to provincial, territorial, Indigenous, or municipal jurisdictions, and it's not constitutionally protected. And so I'm going to make the case for why we're focusing on youth homelessness and prevention in that context I just described. We worked with the Government of Canada to ask a question in the 2018 coordinated point in time count. So that was coordinated across the country. And so every person who is experiencing homelessness at this time was asked the question, what age were you when you first experienced homelessness? And 50% all reported having their first experience before the age of 25. So that's really important for us to know. And here's some data that's a bit shocking as well. And it shows of those first experience of homelessness, around the age of 15, 16 is when most people are having that first experience. And so this data is quite compelling, but in a pretty negative way. It tells us we got to focus on young people and we got to get in there sooner and focus on prevention. It's important to remember that youth homelessness is distinct from adult homelessness, and we have to develop a response based on the needs of developing adolescents and young adults. So let's talk about youth homelessness in Canada. We estimate that there are over 40,000 young people experiencing homelessness across a given year and 7,000 on any given night. And we did a national study in 2016 and 2018 called Without a Home that gave us a lot of insights into the causes and conditions of youth homelessness in Canada. And all of the data pointed to these conclusions, but the main conclusion is we're waiting way too long to intervene. Also, it's important to note that we did a pan-Canadian consultation with young people with lived experience. And at every point in their homelessness journey, they were able to tell us where intervention would have stopped them and their families from being in this crisis. And so it's really important that we shape and design our responses based on what we're hearing from young people and their families. We partnered beginning in 2017 with York University and Dr. Stephen Gates' team around a youth homelessness social innovation lab so that we could build evidence on prevention and sustained exits, and also build the capacity of service providers across this country and all orders of government to do this work better. Our research agenda is focused on prevention and early intervention and sustaining exits from homelessness. And we were awarded a major grant from the Government of Canada that has allowed us to fund 39 original research projects within this agenda across the country. And findings are starting to emerge from this important body of research. In addition, we've been doing demonstration projects on models of prevention and housing first, adapted for the needs of developing adolescents and young adults. Family and natural supports is one of the models. And Youth Reconnect and Upstream are both school-based early intervention models adapted from Australia, and then Housing First for Youth, which is a made in Canada adaptation of Housing First that we have been using with young people exiting the care system as a form of prevention, young people exiting other public systems like the juvenile justice system and the adult justice system, and for young people currently experiencing homelessness. In addition, we take an Indigenous lens to all of this work with Housing First for Indigenous Youth and other adaptations to these models led by our Indigenous partners in Canada. We're doing research and evaluation to understand the outcomes, but we're also doing the developmental evaluation to understand how these interventions work and so that we can strengthen them as we learn, all with the goal of getting better outcomes for young people and their families. And you can see that we're not just focused on whether or not a young person is housed. We're focused on all these other areas that will ensure that a young person either doesn't fall into homelessness or sustains their exits from homelessness, and more importantly, that they thrive. You can see this is a visual of these different interventions. You can notice that family and natural supports is cross-cutting. What we've learned in this work is that we have to focus with all the work we do with young people on strengthening their family, their natural supports, their chosen family, because those relationships are more sustainable than paid relationships. And that's what's really going to help a young person to transition into healthy adulthood. Also, it's important to note, in 2021, the census in Canada revealed that 35% of young adults are living in private households with at least one of their parents. And so anything that we can do to strengthen those relationships to ensure that young people can remain housed is really critical. Enhancing family and natural supports, again, is something that we hear from young people and their families, that this work is often not central in the services we deliver to young people and their families, but they have to be. When we did that national study, 77% of young people said that they would like to improve contact and relationships with their family. All of these interventions we've been doing as demonstration projects in Canada. We've developed public-facing resources so that you can learn more about them. Just go to the homelesshub.ca or to the Away Home website to learn more. And there are a couple of other bright spots I want to point to. In Finland and in Wales, they have youth-focused nonprofit housing associations. And we think that this is something we should move toward in Canada. So again, something to think about, because it's not just for young people experiencing homelessness, but for all young people. And please reach out if you would like any more information about the work that we're doing in Canada. Be happy to have a dialogue. Thank you.
It was not coincidental that we wanted somebody to talk about housing for young people, being in Trondheim and having the election ahead. We can reflect a bit on this, what she said afterwards. Now I would like to introduce to you Claudia Murray. She's a research fellow of urban development at Reading University. She's an architect by qualification at University of Buenos Aires. And her research focuses on social, cultural, and economic implications of urban development. The floor is Claudia's.
Thank you very much, Helen. Is it possible that you enable me to share my screen? Hello? Can you hear me?
You can start, Claudia.
Can I share the screen now? Okay, because you keep saying that the host has disabled the participants.
Try now.
All right. Now it works. Excellent, thank you. Okay, I think I think now you're seeing my screen. Okay, let me just start my watch. Thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you very much for all the speakers before me. I'm going to expand a little bit on community land trust that was mentioned by the first keynote speaker. But first of all, this is a solution that I think is quite interesting to provide affordable housing. But first of all, I'm going to just go over quickly at what we have in the UK in terms of regulations and how the system works. So basically, we collect data, which is essential for calculating and understanding the housing situation in different districts. So this data on new affordable housing is used by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which is like the Ministry of Housing, if you want, here in the UK, and in England. Sorry, the system in the UK is devolved. So Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England, they have different regulations. So I'm going to just focus on England and more specifically in London. This data is used to calculate the new homes bonus enhancement, which is given to local authorities in relation to their performance. So, for example, just to give you some statistics from last year, this is in West London, the borough of Hounslow had, they developed 776 units. Out of them, 143 were affordable. So the council received a bonus. Doing certain calculations, they receive a bonus of 2 million that they can then use for more housing. So if you want to compare that from London to the whole of England, the number of units is more than 250,000, and there's nearly over 500,000 in bonuses given to different councils. So that's roughly about 20% of affordable housing in England. If you want to compare, the beauty that we have here is that we can compare internally with different countries. So if you want to compare these numbers with Scotland, that is quite good in providing affordable housing in the UK, the minimum they produce is between 20 to 25%. So as you can see, England is quite behind Scotland, and even more pressure is in London, that they are below that 20% minimum that should be delivered. So how the housing is delivered? Well, we have the local development plans where we outline the future of the land use for different areas. And we issue targets for different areas, affordable housing targets. They depend on different factors, but also it's important to understand that the concept of affordability, it can be quite wide in England. It can mean social rental housing, affordable rental housing, share ownership, different schemes. For delivery, we also have something that is called the Section 106 agreement that comes from the 1990s, and this outline the contributions that the local authorities developers when they do a development, and this can include affordable housing, but also infrastructure improvements, public amenities, and many more. Now, the other thing that we do is viability assessments. So these are determined, they determine that the maximum amount of affordable housing can be achieved. But this is subject to negotiations. So this is between the developer and the local authority. So the number of affordable units can be discussed, the tenure mix, for example, if it's rental, share ownership, or anything related to the specific location of the affordable housing within the development. Now, sometimes there are land constraints, and the developer cannot provide, or argues that cannot provide affordable housing in the development, so they can give a monetary contribution to the local authority, and then that money is used to fund affordable housing projects elsewhere in the local authority. And again, these are all decisions that are built on case by case and negotiations between developers and the local authorities. So as you can see, the system is quite flexible, but there are problems with this system. You know, for example, there in London, the mayor of London has he announced this year that he's meeting the affordable housing targets that London as a whole has. But there are criticisms to this, and this is my criticism to the system is this system that it just relies on targets and numbers. That these are the type of numbers that the politicians like to tell us about. While you know, we are not talking about quality of the stock. So, for example, the overcrowding rate in the City of London is 8.3%. That was in 2021. So there are criticism of the system in terms of quality, the development of, you know, there's a preference to developing new sites, neglecting the current stock that they are in different local authorities, and also there is criticism that this system neglects the communities, because it's just a ticking box exercise in all this community consultation. So, so the system, in short, it tries to give incentives based on targets for local authorities. But then, like I said, my main criticism is when you base your whole policies on targets, then somebody needs to monitor the quality that you're giving. So, enter the scene the community land trust. The CLTs are democratic non-profit organizations that own the land or property for the benefit of a community. So you can set up a CLT to safeguard affordable housing, but also there are CLTs to protect natural habitats, community enterprises, workspaces, etc. They have different types of governance structure, but the basic is that the community must be involved and have full voting rights.
Or mechanism, she talks about section 106 in the town planning law. Some of the bigger housing associations don't even use that mechanism because they are a non-profit organization and they sort of fund their own housing provision. But I think the CLT, the Community Land Trust that she talks about, is very interesting. Perhaps something that should be considered other places as well. She's not giving us any signals about coming back. No. Okay. Let's then move on to the next one. That is Lucy Lescud-Pla. She is from Paris. She's a project manager for international relations at the Paris Habitat, which is the big city-owned housing developer in Paris, owned by the city. She has a bachelor degree from the University of Autónoma de Madrid on international affairs and a master in governing large metropolis with emphasis on housing policies and infrastructure. She has also studied at Sciences Po in Paris. She has focused on innovative strategies for housing that enhances quality of life for residents. I guess that was what Claudia talked about as well, that quantity of numbers of dwellings is not enough. It's also the quality that's important. So I think Paris has some very interesting tools that that I'm glad she's shared with us.
Hello everyone, my name is Lucie Lescudé and I'm in charge of international relations at Paris Habitat, which is a public social housing company linked to the Paris municipality. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to introduce the French social housing model and some best practices from Paris. The French social housing model targets a significant share of the population. 65% of the population is eligible to become a social housing tenant. Currently, there are about 5 million social dwellings in France, which corresponds to 18% of the population. By law, all French cities with over 1,500 inhabitants have to reach a quota of 25% of social housing by 2025. In France, social housing providers can be either public, in which case they are linked to a local authority, or private. In either case, social housing companies are non-for-profit and all earnings must be reinvested into new construction and the improvement of the existing housing stock. The conditions to access social housing are, first of all, to be either a French citizen or a foreigner with a residence permit, and to have an income inferior to a specific threshold, which is set annually by the national government. There are 3 different categories of social housing, each of them with their own maximum income and rent cap, as you can see on the screen. The first category, for instance, is meant for individuals earning less than 14,000 euros annually, or 32,000 for a family of 4. These 3 types of social housing can be mixed within the same building. The goal here is to guarantee social mix with some low income and middle class households, as well as some more vulnerable individuals, and to avoid social segregation. There is also a 4th category called intermediate housing, targeting the middle and upper middle class, with prices situated between market and social rent. The main funding mechanism of social housing in France is through a savings account called Livret A, which can be opened in any bank by any individual. This account is very popular in France. There are 55 million of them currently, which corresponds to 80% of the French population. The funds which are put into these savings accounts are used by a public bank called Caisse des Dépôts to offer long-term loans to social housing providers. These loans typically have a duration of 40 to 50 years, and this makes up around 75% of financing for new construction and refurbishment. In addition to these loans, there are other sources of funding, such as national and municipal subsidies, tax exemptions, and self-financing. Now, let's talk a bit about the situation in Paris, more specifically. Paris faces some unique challenges compared to many other French cities and European capitals. First of all, Paris is a small city, only 105 square kilometers. It is also a very dense city with a very limited supply of available land for new construction. This, of course, contributes to the high housing prices which characterize the city. 27 euro per square meter per month on average for rental, and 10,000 euro per square meter to buy a home. And as a result, as you can imagine, there is a high demand for social housing in which prices are significantly lower and more affordable. The lack of available land is also something which affects social housing providers in Paris, of course, in this context of high demand for new affordable homes. Despite this, Paris has managed to reach the goal of having 25% of social housing among all primary residences. To achieve this, the municipality has created some policy tools which encourage the development of new social housing supply. First of all, according to the local urban plan, in areas where the 25% social housing quota hasn't been reached, social housing must account for 30% of total floor space in any new housing development of over 800 square meters. This means that private developers have to sell the units to social housing companies prior to construction in order to obtain a building permit. In addition, the city can exercise a preemptive right, also called the right to buy first, in order to support the creation of new social housing. So in areas with a shortage of social housing, land and building owners have to submit a declaration of intent to the municipality before selling a property. The municipality can then decide to buy it, in most cases at the price which was originally suggested by the owner, in order to develop social housing. So just to illustrate, I would like to show you some examples of recent projects by Paris Habitat, which is the public social housing company linked to the municipality. We manage around 125,000 social housing units in Paris, and we house 1 Parisian out of 9. In line with the goals of the City of Paris, we place a strong emphasis on social mix and quality of life in our new projects. Our housing stock is very diverse, as you can see from these 2 examples, and architectural diversity is really something that we are trying to actively encourage so that our buildings can be fully integrated into the city fabric. Due to the lack of available land, our major projects in recent years have focused on the transformation of existing buildings. On these pictures, you can see, for example, a former military complex, which was turned into a mixed-use development with 500 dwellings, including 50% of social housing, in addition to private and intermediate housing, shops, and facilities such as a nursery, a student residence, and a large public park. This is another interesting example. This was a former office building which was turned into a student residence of 140 rooms by conserving the existing building structure and using bio-based material to renovate it. To conclude, I would like to emphasize again the important role of the City of Paris in supporting the social housing sector. In a context where the financial support from the state has been decreasing, a significant part of our subsidies now come from the local authority. And it's not only about financial support, because urban regulations are also very, very important and strongly support the creation of social housing, especially in areas where there is a shortage. These policies are consistent with the national regulatory frameworks, but they really go a step further in making sure that social housing is an integral part of the urban strategy. Thank you so much for your attention. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any further questions. Thank you for listening.
Excellent. When I talked to Lucy before this event, I did think she said at the time that they had a special mechanism for the local authorities to buy plots of land at a cheaper level. But what she said in the presentation here was that the city had this preemptive method of buying land, but at market price. And of course, that's quite a difference. So I guess probably this is the correct version that she's given us there. Yes, then we have come to the last presentation in this section, and that is Robert Temmer, who's going to talk to us. He has a diploma in sociology, and he's an architect from the University of, my German is so bad, Augenwandte Kunst Vienna. Is it right? Almost. He is a researcher, a publicist, and a journalist. His research focuses on housing, city planning, and public spaces. It's interesting to hear about Vienna, which I know one of the, I won't disclose which one, but one of the directors of one of the very biggest housing developers in Oslo said Vienna is like a communist state. Let's listen to it.
Hello, my name is Robert Temmer. I would like to report very briefly now on the Viennese housing model that has emerged over the last 100 years. The key elements of this model are firstly municipal housing, that means apartments that are owned by the city of Vienna. Secondly, subsidized housing, housing subsidies that are allocated by the city. 3, limited profit developers, a special sector of housing production alongside the city and the market. 4, the associated quality assurance. And 5, a land fund of the city which provides low-cost plots of land. Firstly, I would like to do a brief comparison of the situation in Vienna and in Oslo and Trondheim. The scales are different, but the 3 cities have in common that they are growing rapidly. In Norway, even more so than in Vienna. A big difference is the share of tenants in the housing market. This is high in Austria as a whole, but particularly high in Vienna with 76% of all households. As mentioned, the Viennese housing model was developed in the last 100 years. Here a typical example of housing construction from the 1920s. There are about 65 apartments from this period and of this type in Vienna. And this is how it works today. Here you can see the Seestadt Aspern, currently the largest urban development area in Vienna, connected to the city center by underground with partly low-cost housing. This is one of the social housing buildings in Aspern, built about 8 years ago. And here is an overview of the housing stock in Vienna. As I said, 76% of all households are rented apartments. Those are the 3 green bars here. About 43%, about 2/3 of that, is some form of social housing, either municipal housing or non-profit housing. Those are the 2 dark green bars on the left. And here's an overview of what that does. You can see here the gross rent increases of the last 13 years. They were much lower in social housing than in the private market, and this already includes the high inflation of the last year. So I come to the 5 key elements. First of all, municipal housing, of which there are about 195,000 out of a total of about 900,000 households in Vienna, 21%. Currently, only a few new municipal apartments are being built, about 1,000 per year. Municipal housing has a very broad target group. Firstly, to avoid social segregation, and secondly, to secure broad political acceptance. That is why the income limits are relatively high. About 85% of Vienna's population falls below the limit. Here you can see a map of all these municipal housing developments in Vienna. It shows that they are very evenly distributed across the city, from the city center to the outskirts. The second key element is subsidized housing. In Vienna and in Austria in general, there is mainly direct funding for individual housing projects, less for tenants. That means primarily object funding, only to a lesser extent, and where necessary also subject funding. This has the advantage that one can directly influence the quality of the project. Vienna spends about 450 million euros per year on housing subsidies, which includes new construction, renovation and subject subsidies. The total annual housing production is about 15,000 apartments, of which 5,000 are subsidized and 10,000 privately financed. 15 years ago, the ratio was completely different. At that time, there were also 5,000 subsidized apartments, but only 1,000 privately financed. For subsidized housing, there are cost ceilings for the land price and for the maximum annuity for the subsidy loan that may be covered by the rent. The target group is very broad, just as in municipal housing. There are about 200,000 subsidized apartments in Vienna. And since 2009, there has been a smart apartments program for very low incomes as part of the housing subsidy. 50% of all newly built apartments in each subsidized project must fall under this program. The third key element, the subsidized housing is predominantly built by a separate sector, the so-called limited profit building associations. These companies are either cooperatives or limited liability companies or stock corporations, but always non-profit. There are about 50 of them in Vienna. Their activities are regulated by a separate federal law, the Housing Non-Profit Act, which defines that these companies must fulfill tasks serving the common good in the housing and settlement sector. The general conditions for limited profit developers regulated by the Act include a cost rent that must be offered without time limit in perpetuity, a profit limit defined by law of 3.5% of the capital invested, and the obligation to build up capital for housing purposes. Further on, a building obligation, statutory audit, and tax concessions. The special approach of these limited profit developers is very similar to the cooperative principle, as many limited profit developers are cooperatives. In addition to joint ownership by the tenants, there is also private or public ownership of the limited profit developers, but this hardly makes a difference because the Housing Non-Profit Act protects the building association from their owners. The purpose of cooperatives is the benefit of their members, and quite similar to that in limited profit developers, it is the common good in housing. The rent here is cost-based. There's almost no profit beyond what is necessary for the existence of the limited profit developer. There is a cost contribution when you move in and the cost rent without time limit. The cost contribution is roughly paid back when you move out. It is devalued at 1% per year. The increase in value of these houses exists, but is purely theoretical because it can never be realized. The projects can be seen as a contribution to low housing costs for the city as a whole. The fourth key element, all subsidized housing projects are assessed for quality in order to decide on funding according to these four criteria: economy, social sustainability, architecture, and ecology. Smaller projects are evaluated individually for larger development areas of 500 apartments or more. There is a so-called developer competition, that means a competitive procedure in which the best project for each plot is selected. And the fifth key element, in 1984 the city of Vienna founded its own land fund for subsidized housing, which buys land with long-term development prospects at a reasonable price, thereby reducing competition for land among developers, and it coordinates with urban planning. It acts flexibly and can buy large areas and use them much later. It pays a price between green land and developed building land and buys without zoning but sells developed land. Land is sold competitively in developer competitions to the best projects, as I already described. The land fund currently owns about 2.8 million square meters, or 0.7% of the city's area, and has reserves for several years. What you see here is a subsidized limited profit housing project that was completed several years ago. And here is another somewhat more recent project. Within Vienna's subsidized housing, there's also a small program for co-housing where plots are sold specifically to such groups. To summarize briefly, the area of so-called social housing comprises 43% of the total housing stock in Vienna. The policy aims at not siloing by setting income limits high in order to avoid social segregation. Subsidized housing is of significantly higher quality than market-financed housing because there's a well-established quality assurance model. And limited profit developers must offer cost rent for an unlimited period of time. And finally, here's the overview of the most important elements: municipal housing, subsidies from the city of Vienna, limited profit developers, quality assurance for subsidized housing, and the land fund for housing, selling by quality criteria. Thank you.
That was the last of the prepared presentations. There is one person who hasn't been able, which we haven't been able to reach, and that is Maite Arrondo from Barcelona. That's a shame because Barcelona does a lot of interesting things when it comes to affordable housing. But it means that we have a bit more time, extra time. Would you like to have a 5 or let's say 10 minutes break and come back for the debate, or would you like us to start the debate at once? Who wants a break? Looks like quite a lot of people want a break. Let's come back 10 to 6. Ready to start? A few words more in English before we turn into Norwegian, because we'll have the conversation with the political youth wings in Norwegian. First of all, there are 2 master projects that were given grants from Habitat Norway. One exciting kindergarten from South Africa, and one interesting project comparing sharing public space and infrastructure in Norway and Chile. And there are materials here, different types of reports and so on from Habitat Norway on the other side. I guess it's impossible to dive properly into what these policies we heard about are all about, but I guess there are some sort of characteristica that is common for what we hear. First of all, that housing is the sort of foundation for our well-being and prosperity, generally speaking. I think we could see how it even affected national product at the end. We heard that Norway has a high level of owner-occupation for different groups. Even immigrants and single-family households in Oslo have about 48, 50, a bit more owner-occupation housing, which I think is quite unusual. But what we hear from these presentations is that certain groups are invisible. It may be young people, it may be temporary workers, it may be low-income people. And the invisibility is also an inequality as well then, is also strengthened by geography, by the difference between living in city centers and living in the periphery. I think you heard that being presented. I think also what we hear is that the importance of comprehensive housing policies, structurally speaking. That means cooperation, active cooperation between federal and local authorities. It means differentiated policies for different groups. And it means legal framework like the 106 mechanism in the UK. In Norway, I've always said that paragraph 17.3 in the Town and Country Planning Act about utbyggingsavtaler, planning obligations, could easily be used in the same manner if one deleted the word to market price. One could say the city could buy or be able to allocate the flats at a reduced price, then it would all be sold. And then, of course, there's another element, and that is related to land acquisition, because sites are the most price-driving elements we have, I think. And we heard about the preemptive purchase mechanisms that could be used. Could one, for instance, imagine that Oreigningslova in Norway could be developed into such a mechanism? And I think it's also interesting to hear from several of these cities that it's not as if the city should build all these housing units. It's often a combination of private and public bodies. For instance, I know in the UK, I think about 75% of all the affordable dwellings being built are done by private developers, but they have to do it in separate, legally separate companies, units, that have limited or non-profit framework around them. And then, of course, we also heard at the end, what can we as individuals do? And we heard, for instance, from France, this sort of saving accounts mechanism. So in a way, it describes all the different types of comprehensive policies you need to improve things. And I'm not the one who says that the situation in Norway is the worst in the world, to put it that way. Okay, now we're on to pre-election atmosphere. I'm not quite sure what representatives we have present today, so I must ask, is Kenneth Tommermo Reitan here from the Senterpartiet? No. Fremskrittspartiet is here, I know, Arild Svensli, and that's excellent. And then Labour Party, Håkon Einarsve. No. And then Socialist Party, I think they have sort of partly announced that maybe they're not able to come. And then it's the Red Party, Lily Herseth Eikje is here. That's good. And then Nordun from MDG, the Green Party, has just arrived. So then we have, I think it's not too bad. We have one from Fremskrittspartiet, one from Rødt, and one from MDG. And it's interesting that the other big parties are not finding it interesting enough to come. What we will do is that each of you will have 3-4 minutes to say what you think is important in your party's housing policy. And we will start with Arild, and then we will take Lily, and then Nordun. And you come up and talk, and then you go and sit down on the chairs, and then I'll put some questions to you afterwards. I think you had the questions in advance, didn't you? Yes, excellent. So, Arild, the floor is yours. Nei, nå skal vi snakke norsk. Nå kan du fortelle om hva FrP vil gjøre med boligpolitikken.
Tusen takk. For FrP så er det veldig viktig å poengtere at en bolig er et hjem og ikke et skatteobjekt. Og derfor ønsker vi å fjerne eiendomsskatten, både for å gjøre det billigere å eie en bolig, men også fordi vi ser at når du leier en bolig og eieren må nødt til å betale eiendomsskatt, så lemper det bare over på dem som leier boligen, og det presser leieprisene opp. Og så i tillegg så ønsker vi å gjøre det enklere å bygge boliger og gjøre det billigere å bygge boliger. Og det handler om å ha både færre krav til størrelse på bolig og lysforhold og høydebegrensninger og så videre, som gjør det vanskelig å bygge ut boliger. Og vi ønsker også å redusere saksbehandlingstida til kommunen i byggesaker. Og vi ønsker også å sikre skolekapasitet, fordi vi har sett at i flere bydeler, for eksempel Tiller og på Lade, så får man ikke lov til å bygge ut nye boliger, fordi vi har for dårlig skoledekning. Og det er rett og slett noe som har blitt for dårlig prioritert i mange år. Og så ønsker vi også å se på formueskatten. Fordi det har seg sånn at hvis du har en stor formue, så lønner det seg å investere i boliger, rett og slett fordi du får en rabatt på formuen din ved å eie mange boliger. Og det gjør jo da at folk som har masse penger, gjerne investerer i boliger, som tar dem av markedet og inn i leiemarkedet, sånn at det blir dyrere å kjøpe boliger da. Det presser boligprisene oppover. Og så ønsker vi også å bygge mindre boliger, rett og slett fordi at folk ikke nødvendigvis har en partner. Det er flere og flere som kjøper en bolig alene, og de ønsker ikke nødvendigvis å ha en så stor leilighet som det som bygges i dag, og derfor må vi tillate at det bygges mindre boliger. Og så til slutt så må vi sørge for at de som virkelig trenger det, har tilgang på en kommunal bolig. Det er jo en lang kø i dag. På sist jeg sjekket over 200 personer som står og venter på en kommunal bolig. Og da må vi sikre at de som virkelig har behov for det, får en kommunal bolig. Tusen takk.
Kan jeg få lov å spørre om noe? Formueskatten, skulle den opp eller ned?
Vi ønsker å fjerne den, rett og slett fordi det insentiviserer da. Folk med mye penger til å kjøpe massevis av boliger, insentiviserer dem til å investere i boligmarkedet. Og det presser jo da prisene opp, fordi kapitalsterke personer konkurrerer mot svake personer.
Ok, da kan du sette deg der borte. Og så var den neste på listen, det var, skal vi se, det er bare... Igjen, ja. Da er det Lili.
Ja, det var vel sånn at jeg skulle ta noe av de største, hva vi ser på som noen store problemer, og også noen løsninger, var vel ikke sånn?
Særlig løsningene.
Ja, særlig løsningene, men...
Hva dere vil bidra med for å løse problemene?
Ja, nei, der ser man jo en del at du har en del veldig dyre leiepriser, de driver opp, mens også samtidig så er ikke standarden på de boligene veldig høy. Du ender fort opp med å leie leiligheter med masse mugg i for mesteparten av lønna di. En ting vi tenker kunne vært en god idé der er at å innføre regler rundt å ha tak på husleia bundet til lønna di. Da i kommunale boliger så prøver vi også å få til at det kun kan være 20% av lønna di. Sier at akkurat nå så ser man at det er dit mesteparten av inntekter går. Jeg har ikke notatene mine, for jeg har ikke skrevet opp nøyaktig hva det var jeg skulle si. Vi ser også at det er en del utleiere, spesielt at det er såpass mange små utleiere som ikke egentlig helt vet hva reglene er, eller bare ikke forholder seg til dem. Det er relativt vanlig å få beskjed av spesielt mindre utleiere at du tror jeg bryter reglene, hvorfor flytter du ikke bare? Der tror vi at vi kunne ha kjent litt på å ha litt strengere regler, og faktisk også håndheve de reglene som eksisterer i dag. I tillegg så sliter man jo generelt sett med å komme seg inn på boligmarkedet både for leie og eie. Der tror vi rett veldig på å styrke en tredje boligsektor, og ting sånn som Boligstiftelsen i Trondheim. Sånn litt kort.
Og det betyr at da tenker dere at kommunen ikke bør kjøpe opp, overta Boligstiftelsen?
Ja, den er vi ganske klar på at det vil vi ikke at de skal gjøre. Vi vil at Boligstiftelsen skal bestå sånn som den er i dag, om ikke styrkes.
Ja. Flott. Da tar vi Norrøn da.
Supert. Hei, hyggelig å være her. Jeg heter Norrøn, stiller til valg for MDG og så i Grønn Ungdom. Hvor skal man starte? Det var jo snakk om litt sånn nasjonal boligpolitikk og sånn. Og eielinja tenkte jeg å bare starte litt med, hvor vi har tilrettelagt veldig for at nordmenn skal eie sin egen bolig. Har jo fungert til en viss grad ved at mange nordmenn eier bolig i dag, men den har også delvis feilet. Og vi vet jo at i Norge så bolig et veldig attraktivt spekulasjonsobjekt, hvor mange investerer mye i bolig, og gjerne investerer i sekundærboliger også. Og vi i MDG tror at altså på lang sikt, så vi nødt til å ta tak i dette, og på en måte anerkjenne det at det så attraktivt i Norge å investere i bolig, med på å drive boligprisene opp. Og da må vi også tørre å gjøre noe med det. Og så går ikke MDG inn for noen sånne drastiske endringer i den nasjonale boligpolitikken, fordi at det vil påvirke veldig mange forskjellige folk i ulike økonomiske situasjoner også. Men vi mener for eksempel at det å gradvis fjerne rentefradraget vil være en god idé, fordi at man slutter å subsidiere veldig mange boligeiere da, gjennom rentefradraget. En annen ting som vi kanskje kan komme litt inn på jo skatt på bolig og skatt på sekundærbolig. Og vi mener jo det at man burde ha en høyere skatt på sekundærboliger enn på primærboligen. Så vil jeg bare kommentere litt på det her med mindre boliger og lysforhold og sånne der ting. Så blir jeg ganske bekymret egentlig over en utvikling hvor en del utbyggere har lyst til å bygge veldig smått. Det ikke det vi trenger. Vi trenger at det bygges variabelt, at det bygges både små og større leiligheter, at det bygges forskjellige typer boliger over hele byen og ulike deler av byen. Men vi kan ikke gå ned på kvaliteten eller lysforholdene eller på en måte grøntarealer eller sånne der kvalitetsting for å bygge flere boliger. Det ganske åpenbart hvorfor egentlig. Det handler om folk sine leveforhold. Til kommunen så burde vi selvsagt bygge flere kommunale boliger. Så det jo lett å si før et lokalvalg, men virkelig, det trenger vi. De også bør spres utover byen, og ikke bare være på ett sted. Boligstiftelsen gjør jo en viktig jobb med å gi bolig til for eksempel de som ikke får kommunalbolig, men som likevel utsatte. Så den må vi bevare. Starte med det. Gleder meg.
Mange takk skal du ha. Siden det MDG som snakker, så kan jeg jo da minne om at MDG, min tidligere byråd, Hanna Markussen, eller byrådet da i Oslo, for det var jo det, gikk imot liberaliseringen av altså sekundærlovgivningen, om det der med 5 ganger krav om 5 ganger, egenkapital, og så var det også på rentenivå i forhold til sekundærboliger, og sa at når regjeringen liberaliserte det, så ville det gjøre det vanskelig for folk flest å komme inn på boligmarkedet. Jeg vil spørre dere først av alt, utifra det dere nå har sett dere tre, hva det dere synes mest relevant for en norsk eller en Trondheims situasjon å kunne tenke videre på? Ja, Lili.
Det litt sånn klare svaret synes jeg jo det som allerede i Trondheim, det med boligstiftelser. Og det her med ikke-kommersielt utleie. Som man ser flere andre plasser også, tydeligvis. Veldig interessant å lære om de andre plassene. Men jeg tror det noe som Trondheim kan ha mer av.
Ja, og det du sa nå om at det ikke for de helt vanskeligstilte, for der har man de kommunale boligene, men det for en mellomgruppe, og det jo kanskje det skiktet som Norge har dårligst regime for, da, på en måte. Dere andre, hva vil dere si? Arvid?
Altså, vår holdning jo å gjøre det så billig som mulig, og både eie og leie en bolig. Både gjennom skattesystemet og bygge boliger som mindre, og som koster mindre å bygge, og som har lavere markedsverdi, da. Sånn at det blir mulig for dem med lavere inntekter også å komme seg inn på boligmarkedet. Og det handler jo ikke bare om skattesystemet i sammenheng med bolig, men det handler jo også om at vi ønsker å generelt kutte skattene for dem med lavere inntekter, både gjennom frikort og lavere inntektsskatt og andre typer skatteordninger.
Kan jeg få utfordre deg litt? Det størrelsen og kvalitetsgraden som problemet, eller det finansieringsordningene som problemet med det der med å få boliger for de som ikke har så mye å rutte med?
Finansieringsordninger til utbyggerne?
Nei, jeg tenker på lånemuligheter, fradragsmuligheter, subsidiering mot særskilte deler av boligmarkedet og så videre.
Ja, altså for unge sin del, for eksempel, så vi jo veldig opptatt av at du kan spare opp penger gjennom BSU-ordninger. Den ble jo svekket nå, dessverre, av regjeringen. Vi ønsker jo å styrke den ordningen. Og så glemte jeg hva jeg skulle si, men BSU-ordningen veldig viktig for unge.
For det jeg liksom fisket litt etter var jo at det å bygge dårligere og dårligere og dårligere gir ikke noe stabilt boligområde.
Ja, det ønsker vi ikke heller.
Nei, men du sa ta bort krav og ta bort hva nevnte du? Du sa fravær av krav, ja.
Jeg kan gi et eksempel da. For eksempel trenger du å ha så store krav til uteareal når du bor rett ved siden av en park?
Ja da, nei, men jeg skjønner den problemstillingen. Nore?
Ja, jeg vil bare starte med å svare litt på det fra FRP da, fordi at nå har vi et ganske lite regulert boligmarked i Norge, og vi har også lave skatter på bolig, og det har jo ikke fungert så veldig bra til nå. Vi har veldig høye boligpriser som går veldig mye opp, spesielt i byene, og det å tro at vi skal fortsette å ha et lite regulert marked, og at det skal føre liksom, på et eller annet magisk vis slutte og fortsette den utviklingen vi har, da, det tror jeg virkelig ikke på. Jeg tror vi nødt til å liksom, tørre å tenke litt annerledes da, og se på de store, langsiktige tingene. Det som med BSU at det funker for mange, men det i stor grad jo de som allerede har litt ekstra, de som har noe å sette inn på BSU, og for alle de som ble nevnt, kanskje ikke de som har rett på kommunalbolig for eksempel, men ungdom som kommer fra familier med dårligere råd, så hjelper jo ikke BSU overhodet, og det jo kanskje de som vi trenger å hjelpe aller mest.
Men vi ønsker jo da å hjelpe dem ved å la dem beholde mer av sine egne penger, i stedet for å subsidiere dem.
Hva vil MDG gjøre, tenker du, ikke sant, når du tar den om at det kanskje ikke de som trenger det mest som bruker BSU, hva tenker dere vil være en bedre ordning for ungdom?
Det var jo et godt spørsmål. Jeg mener at vi burde ha en annerledes BSU-ordning, eller en annerledes spareordning egentlig, som mer sosialt innrettet. Så beklageligvis så har jeg ikke liksom fasiten på hvordan den burde innrettes. Men jeg synes det veldig godt prinsipp at ungdom skal få spare til bolig, men per nå så har ikke den ordningen fungert sånn som den burde ha fungert da.
Var det noe annet dere så på disse eksemplene som dere synes var interessant? Lille, du kan godt.
Nei, jeg skulle bare sånn kjapt på det med andre måter du som kanskje kan hjelpe ungdom i de situasjonene. Så en ting som jeg tror hadde gjort ting veldig mye lettere, hvis det var lettere å få bostøtta. For sånn som det i dag, så det flere ting som utelukker deg fra bostøtta, som veldig mange ungdom ender opp med å falle inn under. Sånn som at du får ikke at det veldig vanskelig å få bostøtte hvis du bor i kollektiv. Du har også sånne merkelige greier med hvis du lærling, så mister du en del tilgang på ting fra Nav og sånt nå, som gjør at det veldig mange unge som sliter med å få noe, og det å gjøre denne ordningen lettere å få noe av, hadde kanskje fungert bedre enn å ha noen BSU-ordning og sånt nå, fordi at sånn som jeg har en BSU-konto, men har ikke noe på den, fordi jeg har aldri hatt noe å legge inn. Da hjelper det ikke å la meg beholde mer av de pengene som jeg ikke har i første omgang. Og da kan det kanskje hjelpe å gi bostøtte. For sånn som det er i dag, så tar det ekstremt lang tid, og du får ganske lite, hvis du får noe i det hele tatt.
Jeg vil spørre om et annet av de spørsmålene dere fikk på forhånd. Jeg sa i sted at tomteprisene veldig drivende for boligprisene. Dette jo sånn 10 000 kroner spørsmål, så hvis vi gamlingene ikke har svar, så det selvfølgelig sånn at det helt greit at ikke dere har svar. Men hva tenker dere at man kunne gjøre med den utfordringen? Jeg tror ofte så tomteprisene mellom 40-50% av altså prisen på den enkelte bolig.
Altså det ble litt vel spesifikt for meg, men jeg så på slutten her fra Wien at kommunen hadde kjøpt opp veldig store arealer, så kanskje man kan tenke litt i den retningen og prøve ut noen ordninger på det.
Altså jeg vet, Sadiq Khan, borgmesteren i London, han ba om en lovhjemmel fra den konservative regjeringen, han var jo Arbeiderpartiet, for å kunne lave byfornyelsesområder, sånn som vi hadde på 80-tallet, hvor man frøs tomteprisverdiene. Han får nok neppe den hjemmelen. Men det klart det der med å kunne... Mange kommuner, Oslo, har jo ikke tomter igjen, fordi mesteparten ble solgt på 80- og 90- og begynnelsen av 2000-tallet, blant annet for å ruste opp skoler. Men det å kunne ha en eller annen mekanisme hvor man kunne få tilgang til rimeligere boliger, ville jo sikkert være bra. Og så var det noen som sa her at det var prøvd blant annet i India, og at det ble også veldig upopulært, fordi det ble på en måte, da var det kommunen som spekulerte, altså man kjøpte store arealer liksom inntil eller utenfor byen, og satt på det i 30 år, og de som da hadde vært grunneiere fikk ikke noe av den fortjenesten da, på en måte. Hva mener FrP om dette?
Nei, altså jeg tror ikke vi har drøftet det i kommunegruppa, for å si det sånn, men altså vi vil jo være veldig forsiktige med å gjøre noe som helst som krenker eiendomsretten.
Ja.
Altså, så det jo et sterkt hensyn som må tas, men jeg tror ikke vi sitter på den beste, nei, ikke den beste, vi sitter på en løsning.
Nei. Og hva med Rødt da?
Nei, nå tror jeg heller ikke vi har drøftet det her i bystyregruppa, i hvert fall ikke så lenge jeg har vært involvert der, som begynner å bli en stund nå.
Ja, men jeg skjønner, det jo det et veldig vanskelig spørsmål. Jeg skjønner det også. Ja. Og så det mer generelle spørsmålet igjen da. Hva vil ditt parti gjøre for folk som har dårligere forutsetning til å skaffe seg en sikker og trygg bolig? Altså da kan du gå både på leiesiden og på anskaffelsessiden, altså det å kjøpe. Her kan dere jo egentlig trekke frem. Du, Norun, sa jo det der med trappevis... Ja, nei, jeg skal komme tilbake til det. Hva kan man gjøre for at folk skal få en trygg og god bolig? Tenker dere? Hva det aller viktigste? Norun?
Det var vanskelig å svare på hva som det aller viktigste, men jeg fikk jo litt lyst til å nevne tredje boligsektor og en del av de tingene som dere nok har hørt veldig mye om nå i sted, med måter hvor du kan, for eksempel om kommunen kan kreve at noen boliger bygges og leies ut til, eller selges til selvkostpris, eller man har sånn leie til eieordninger. Jeg tenker det finnes ganske mange innretninger, eller det høres ut som det finnes veldig mange innretninger å gjøre det på, men det prinsippet om at man at kommunen på en måte tar en del av ansvaret og sørger for at prisen lav, jo veldig fin, og det handler jo også om den tryggheten på en måte som man får da, for eksempel som man har hatt i Boligstiftelsen, at det å ha en leiekontrakt som langsiktig for eksempel, og hvor du ikke risikerer å bli kastet ut på kort varsel og sånne ting, jo også en veldig viktig rettighet da, en viktig ting som gjør livet mer stabilt og trygt.
Jeg lærte jo noe av det Kathrine sa, at det vi gjør i Oslo med leie til eie og Oslo-bolig, da, som har som intensjon å kjøpe opp 10% av boligene og gi de videre til redusert pris, det egentlig å bare finansiere første sektoren. Altså, det hadde ikke jeg tenkt ordentlig over. Det som jo et dilemma med allmennboligene, sånn som de i Danmark, jo at det blir et gullkort for de som kommer inn, fordi du kan sitte på dem evigvarende, og jeg tror det til og med sånn at familiemedlemmer kan arve. Og jeg kjenner ikke reglene veldig godt, så jeg tar forbehold om det. Og det jo ofte dilemma. Hvis du skal subsidiere, så det en veldig fin ting for de som får kjøpt i første runde, men så det det med hvordan du skal ha tilbakekjøps. Altså fra eie til leie så det vel sånn at Obos kjøper tilbake, ja, det ulike vilkår da, men sånn at da begrenses liksom fortjenesten til det du selv har betalt for og så videre. Men det vel allmennboligenes dilemma. Og i noen land så tror jeg ikke, altså i Paris så sier vi, ja, hva skjer med de når folk har bodd der 15-20 år? Nei, da gjør de ikke noe mer med det. Ikke sant? Men det jeg tror det fordi de produserer så mange rimelige boliger at veldig mange får. Ikke sant? Hun fra Paris sa at 65% eligible til å få den type bolig. Arild, hva ville du sagt sånn generelt? Du har jo sagt en del om det allerede.
Vi ønsker jo å fjerne egenkapitalkravet, for eksempel. Sånn at folk som ikke har muligheten til å spare opp masse penger også skal få muligheten til å få lån. Og så igjen så vil jeg jo trekke frem da og la folk få beholde mer av sine egne penger i stedet for at vi skal subsidiere forskjellige grupper, så må vi la folk få prioritere sine egne penger selv.
Jeg tror MDG hadde en kommentar her.
Ja. Jeg vil bare uttrykke litt skepsis over at løsningen handler om å la folk ta opp enda større lån eller låne enda mer, da, fordi at i Norge så har husholdningene veldig store lån, og det til og med noe som liksom pekes på som en risikofaktor for økonomien vår, at vi har så mye lån, og folk bruker nok av tid på å betale ned. Så jeg tror det veldig fornuftig, sånn som vi har det i dag, at vi har en del begrensninger på hvor mye lån du kan ta opp, selv om de gjør det litt vanskeligere, ja, å få seg nok penger til bolig, men det altså det en grunn til at vi har dem der, og jeg tror det veldig lurt at vi tenker annerledes om det da.
Arild?
Ja, det vil jeg jo si tilbake at det jo nettopp dem som ikke har muligheten til å spare opp en stor egenkapital som da blir sittende utenfor. Og så vil jeg jo si at løsningen på at boligene for dyr jo rett og slett å bygge flere boliger. Nye boligbygginger har nesten stoppet helt opp i for eksempel Oslo og flere deler av landet. Og det må reguleres mye flere boliger enn det gjøres i dag.
Der utfordret du meg, vet du. Jeg jobbet som byplansjef i Oslo i 20 år, men det regulert 11 000 boliger ferdig i Oslo. Og da snakker vi ikke om områderegulering som krever ekstra reguleringslån etterpå. Og nå boligbyggingen gått ned med 65%. Og da blir jo spørsmålet hvordan kan man få prisene ned? Og da dette her med tomteprisene veldig viktig, tror jeg. Men det ikke gitt at fordi om du regulerer veldig mye mer at prisene går ned. Og det altså, det jo nesten litt sånn fait accompli at i veldig mange av europeiske storbyer så går prisene opp åkke som, og da må du ha en eller annen mekanisme da, for å håndtere et rimeligere boligtilbud.
Og der tror jeg jo skattesystemet med på å drive prisen opp da, fordi det lønner seg så mye som det gjør å investere i bolig som det gjør i dag.
Ja da. Og så hadde jeg lyst til å si at det der med formuesskatten som skulle ned, kanskje det ville føre til enda mer investeringer i sekundærbolig, men det bør vi ikke ta. Lili?
Ja, nei, jeg bare sånn, også når jeg snakker om litt sånn å gjøre det enklere å få lån, så sitter jeg litt igjen med den at jeg i en såpass heldig situasjon at det ser ut til at jeg faktisk får komme meg inn på boligmarkedet, selv som ung. Sånn, men jeg sitter litt og føler at jeg vet ikke helt om jeg vil. Og at jeg føler meg egentlig ganske komfortabel med å drive og leie, i hvert fall så lenge du har gode vilkår og jeg ikke risikerer å bli kastet ut på kort varsel, noe jeg allerede har vært borti og sånt nå. Men at jeg vet ikke helt om det å være låst fast i en bolig som jeg eier noe for meg, og jeg lurer litt på om FRP har noen løsninger da, som ikke bare er å styrke opp i den eierordningen, men om at det kanskje, om dere har noen ideer til ting som kan gjøres for resten av boligmarkedet?
Det handler jo for eksempel om å fjerne eiendomsskatten, som vil presse leieprisene nedover. Fordi noen må jo betale den eiendomsskatten, og det blir jo faktisk leietakerne. Det er ikke sånn at de som eier boligene tar inn sin egen margin, og altså tar mindre profitt fordi de må betale mer skatt. Da lemper de jo det over på leietakerne. Så det å fjerne eiendomsskatten, det tror jeg vil hjelpe både dem som eier og dem som leier.
Jeg tror vi går til det siste spørsmålet som jeg tenkte jeg skulle spørre dere om, og det er dette med om ditt parti spesielt er interessert i å utvikle tredje boligsektor i Norge. NDG har vel nesten allerede svart, men du kan supplere litt, Norun, hvis du vil.
Ja, jeg kan prøve å supplere litt. Som sagt så er det jo, ja, tredje boligsektor er sånn, litt sånn rart og stort begrep, har jeg veldig inntrykk av. Og det er mange måter å innrette det på. Men jeg tror, sånn som vi var inne på, dette med eie til leie er veldig fornuftig. Og også tilrettelegge for alternative boformer og mer sånne kollektive boformer og en god del sånne ting. Så ja, jeg tror men det skjer jo veldig mye spennende. Det er en del som vi har vært inne på Boligstiftelsen, men det er jo også en del andre initiativer som prøver ut nye måter å bo på, og det tror jeg vi skal virkelig støtte opp om.
Lili, vil du ta...
I Rødt, da spesielt i Trondheim, tror jeg, så er vi veldig for det med tredje boligsektor, og da spesielt den måten som Kathrine definerte på med allmennboliger. Ja. Jeg var med å skrive programmet til Rødt Trondheim nå før valget, og da fikk jeg egentlig pushet gjennom å prøve å satse på det i stedet for å drive med leie til eierordninger og en del sånt nå, fordi at vi vil satse mer på tredje boligsektor i stedet for å bare sånn finne måter å få folk inn i første sektoren. Så i hvert fall nå her i Trondheim så satser vi en god del på det, og har fått gjort, jeg er veldig fornøyd med at jeg har fått pushet det internt i partiet til å bli en så stor sak som det har blitt. For nå er det en sånn konstant ting som er tatt opp på en del møter, og det er vi prøver å finne måter å pushe krav for det inn i nesten alt. Vi prøver å finne måter vi kan pushe inn i reguleringsplaner som kommer og sånt nå. Så det er noe vi har en god del fokus på.
Ja, spennende. Og FRP?
Ja, her kommer det upopulære svaret. Nei, vi ønsker ikke en tredje boligsektor. Men vi ønsker velkommen private leie-til-eie-tiltak, og vi ønsker å bygge flere boliger enn det gjøres i dag. Vi ønsker å bygge mindre, sånn at gjøre det billigere både å leie og eie boliger. Så vi ønsker heller å satse på markedet og gjøre det billigere å ha en bolig enn det er i dag.
Dere har forskjellige strategier for å håndtere utfordringen. Vi hører jo at dere alle tre partier er opptatt av at det er en utfordring. Det er i alle fall det viktigste, å erkjenne at det er en utfordring. Og så blir det jo utrolig spennende. Det blir veldig spennende i Oslo, men det blir jammen spennende i Trondheim også, hvordan valget går der. Så det får vi vente og se på. Før jeg gir dere en applaus, så vil jeg bare få lov å takke de som har vært med å organisere denne dagen. Både programmessig og teknisk. Erik, Anders, Hans, Peter Gortz, Laura Podolsky og alle dere andre som har vært med. Sa jeg jo, jeg sa Hans også. Dere har gjort en kjempejobb, og for oss har det vært veldig morsomt å være med på dette, og jeg ønsker i alle fall Trondheim all lykke til med boligforsyningen, for det trenger vi alle sammen. Takk for at dere var med.